In the previous video, we introduced a third type of market, and the market called monopolistic competition. And we talked about how monopolistic competition has some features similar to perfect competition and other features similar to monopoly. Now, what are the differences in terms of market outcomes? So in perfect competition, we see low prices and an efficient level of output. This is the case where we just have a supply and demand model that looks very much like what we saw when we first introduced supply and demand, and there's so much competition that the market just does what it does, right? And it moves toward that market equilibrium point, which is the most efficient point in a market. A monopoly, on the other hand, is going to, rather than choosing a level of output that is most efficient, they're going to choose a level of output that is maximizes their profit. And so when they do that, what they end up doing is charging higher prices and producing lower levels of output, inefficient levels of output. So where does monopolistic competition stand in all of this? And you probably can guess it's going to be somewhere in between, right? Prices not quite as low as perfect competition, not quite as high as monopoly. Levels of output not quite as low as monopoly, not quite as high as perfect competition. So let's look at how this all shakes out on our graphs. So this is a graph. These are two graphs of firms in monopolistic competition. So notice a couple of things. One, that the demand curve is downward sloping for these types of firms. So remember, in perfect competition, we saw demand curves that were flat, that were horizontal. And the reason for that was that the firms were all producing and selling identical products and had no control over what the price would be of their product, had no control over what their customers were willing to pay for their product. That was just sort of given to them by market conditions, right? And then we saw in a monopoly situation where the downward sloping demand curve of the market was the demand curve for the firm, and so the monopolist faced a downward sloping demand curve, and we saw that when their demand curve was downward sloping, it also meant that marginal revenue curve was downward sloping, and that it was always beneath demand, because marginal revenue is always going to be lower than your price. When increasing your level of output means you have to lower your price for all of your customers, including those who were around before. So if you don't remember that piece, go back to the Monopoly section and watch those videos again on why marginal revenue is downward sloping and why it is beneath the demand curve. Because that same concept applies here for monopolistic competition. And so a firm in monopolistic competition has a demand curve, as you see in these two graphs, that is downward sloping, but generally somewhat more elastic than the demand curve in most monopoly situations. And so the reason for that is that you are a monopoly in a sense. So think again about the Big Mac. McDonald's has a monopoly over the Big Mac, and so they have a downward sloping demand curve for Big Macs. But there is some competition. There are some substitutes available for the Big Mac, and so your customers are somewhat elastic in their demand for the Big Mac, meaning if you really hiked up your prices, they're going to go get a Whopper, right? So we see a downward sloping demand curve because of that monopoly characteristic, but we see that it's somewhat flat, sort of elastic because of the competition part, right? But for exactly the same reasons that we saw under monopoly, we'll see that these firms in monopolistic competition, since they have a downward sloping demand curve, they're going to have a downward sloping marginal revenue curve that's below the demand curve. And in fact, that has a slope of 2 times the slope of the demand curve. And so they'll start, the marginal revenue starts at the same place on the vertical axis as the demand curve, and it'll fall to a point halfway on the horizontal axis to where the demand crosses the horizontal axis. So just like we saw under monopoly. The only difference here is that the demand curve may be slightly flatter than it would be in most monopolies. So what we're looking at here in this slide is 2 situations that a monopolistically competitive firm could be in. And so let's look first at the one on the left. So this is a profitable situation. This firm, like any firm ever, is going to follow the profit maximizing rule. What is that? The profit maximizing rule is that a firm will choose its level of output such that marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And it does not matter whether you're in perfect competition, whether you're in monopoly, whether you're in monopolistic competition, or any type of firm you are, this is how you maximize your profit. You choose your level of output so that marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So this firm is going to choose this level of output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And then, no matter who you are, no matter what type of firm, what type of market you're in, you'll always set your price equal to the height of the demand curve at that quantity, right? Why is that? Because the demand curve tells you what your consumers are willing to pay. And you certainly don't want to set a price higher than that or you won't sell all your products. And you don't want to set a price lower than that or you've just shot yourself in your foot. You could have charged them more. They were willing to pay more, right? And so you choose your level of output first, equal to your profit maximizing level of output. And then you essentially ask your customers, all right, now what are y'all willing to pay? And you get that information off your demand curve. And so you set your price equal to the height of the demand curve. And your profit then is the space between that price and your average cost of producing your quantity, your product at that when you're producing that quantity, right? And so the profit in this case is positive because price is higher than average total cost, right? So this rectangle here, where there's the space between price, which is your average revenue, your revenue per product that you sell, and your average cost per product that you sell, right? The difference between those is your profit per item that you sell, and then you multiply that by how many you sell and you get your whole profit, right? So this rectangle here. So the firm on the left is a monopolistically competitive firm that is earning positive profit. The demand curve is above the average total cost curve at the profit maximizing quantity. The one on the right, on the other hand, you can see that's not going to be the case because here the demand curve is always beneath their average total cost, which means people are not willing to pay enough for your product to cover your cost of producing it. So again, you'll choose your level of output where you're maximizing your profit, but in this case, even maximizing your profit, your average cost is higher than the price you're able to charge. And so this firm is in an unprofitable situation. So again, the firm on the left is earning positive profits. The firm on the right is earning negative profits. In the short run, a monopolistically competitive firm may earn profits or losses, depending on which of these which of these pictures matches what's going on in their market. And it really is just a matter of the demand for your product relative to the cost of producing your product, right? And that would be a characteristic of your firm in your market. What happens in the long run? What's going to happen in the long run to these firms? Remember that we have free entry and free exit in these markets, meaning people are free and easily can come in and start selling burgers. It's also easy to stop selling burgers. Remember what that did to us in the long run in perfectly competitive markets? It meant that when folks were earning profits, more firms would come, right? And more firms would come until they drove profits down to zero. And when firms were losing profit, firms would exit. And they would exit until they drove profits back up to zero. And so in perfect competition, we saw that this free entry, free exit characteristic meant that our long run profits were always exactly zero economic profit because of this shifting around, the free entry and free exit. If there's positive profit, people will come. If there's negative profit, people will go. And the only place that people stop coming and going is at zero profit. We're going to see that same thing happen in monopolistic competition, but with a little different picture. All right? So Keep in mind, here's what our monopolistically competitive firms look like. Some of them earn positive profit, some of them earn negative profits. What will happen in this market, the one on the left where there's positive profit? Because there's free entry, because it's easy, so for example, say we're selling burgers, right? Because it's easy to start selling burgers, more firms will begin to sell burgers, right? In perfect competition, when that happened, we saw the supply curve shifting. The reason for that is that everyone was selling exactly the same burger. And so when a new firm came to town selling burgers, it changed the supply of burgers in the market. Here, we're going to have a little bit different story. So say you're selling Big Macs, and you're making a bunch of money selling Big Macs, and because you're selling a bunch of Big Macs and making a lot of money, Burger King notices and moves into town. What happens in the market for Big Macs when Burger King comes to town? It's not a supply shift because Burger King doesn't make Big Macs, right? Burger King doesn't affect the supply of Big Macs. What does Burger King affect? They affect the demand for Big Macs, right? Because they sell a competing product. They sell a Whopper. And so what we'll see is when firms are earning positive profits, those competitive firms will move into town, which will shift the demand for your product down until you're no longer earning profit, right? And on the flip side, if a firm is earning negative profits, we'll start to see those burger chains leaving town, and as they do, demand for your Big Mac goes up because there aren't as many substitutes left in town, and so demand curve will shift until your profits are zero. And so the long-run situation for monopolistic competition looks like this. Demand will shift until it is exactly tangent to or barely touching the average total cost curve. And when it's barely touching the average total cost curve is when profits are zero. Remember, these are economic profits, so it doesn't mean you're losing money in an accounting sense. It just means that when we consider all of your other options, your opportunity costs, you are breaking even, right? So you couldn't have done any better in another market. So in monopolistic competition, just like in perfect competition, we'll see a long-run economic profit of zero. The mechanism through which we get there is a little different. In perfect competition, we see supply curves shifting around, and in monopolistic competition, we see demand curves shifting around, but the result is the same. When there's free entry and free exit in a market, people will come and people will go until profits are driven to exactly zero. In this case, in monopolistic competition, that means we're going to move the demand curve to the point where the price is exactly equal to average total cost. Or in other words, our average profit is zero. Our profit per item that we sell is zero, and our overall total profit then is zero.